Okay, everybody, we're going to review a little bit more information about relative risk. We're going to talk about some odds ratios. We're going to review some calculations that are not going to be on the test or the final, but you will be required to know how to use these when we're doing our create a study assignment as part of the final. And then we're going to talk about attributable risk briefly. We're not going to look at the calculations for attributable risk, but we'll talk about some of the theory behind it. All right, so a little bit more again about relative risk. There was an article maybe 3 or 4 months ago in the New York Times and a number of other media sources. And they reported that the obesity rate for young children plummets 43% in a decade. So as soon as I knew this, I knew that they were using relative risk versus absolute risk because um, the obesity rate in children is probably about 15% overall, and some of the higher groups may be approaching 20. But overall, it's like 15%. So how can it drop 43%? Um, so it sounds like great news, right? What they found really overall is that if you look at all the information that they collected, almost the obesity rate in almost every single group remained exactly the same, which is pretty much good news because it had been significantly increasing for every decade prior to that. So at least it seems to have leveled off. In one group, in the 2 to 5 year old age group, the obesity rate dropped slightly from 14% to 8%. Okay, so in terms of absolute rates, that's a 6% drop. So that's not bad. But it's one group, 2 to 5 year olds, who you know they probably shouldn't be obese anyway. Um, but it doesn't really, it's not enough to really get people excited. But if you look at it in relative terms, um, it seems much bigger than the reduction actually was. So to find the relative rate, you take the percentage of the decrease, which is 6%, and divide that by the original prevalence rate of 14%. Okay, so 6 divided by 14 is 43%. So the relative rate dropped 43%, but the absolute rate only dropped 6%. All right, so the article probably wouldn't have gotten much press if it was entitled Obesity Rates Remains the Same for Most Groups. Young people saw a very slight drop, so hopefully the trend will continue and the obesity rates will at least level off and maybe start to decrease slightly. But the saying that young people dropped, the obesity rate in young people dropped 43% is a bit of an exaggeration. Sometimes they use relative risk in advertisement. So Lipitor and some of the other statins are a good idea. So in people that have had a heart attack, Lipitor is great at preventing a second heart attack. There's no question. As far as the benefit to people that have never had a heart attack, the risk is not, or excuse me, the benefit is not quite as pronounced. And the clinical trials that they ran, now this is people that have not had a heart attack, but people that have high cholesterol. And they're looking at, how effective is Lipitor against a placebo at reducing risk of heart attack. And what they found was that in the placebo group, the rate of cardiovascular events during the study was 3%. And in the statin, it was about 2%. Okay, so really the statin lowered the risk, the absolute risk by 1%. But again, if you're using the relative risk, 1.9% divided by 3 equals 64%. So the relative risk reduction is actually 36%. So saying it reduces the risk of heart attack by 36%, it sounds a lot better than by 1%. So it may, I'm kind of reading through this pretty quickly. If you want some more information on there, or maybe listen to this a couple times and you might get it. I know it sounds kind of confusing, but if you review it a couple times, I think it'll click for you. Um, so again, Lipitor and other statins are very effective at preventing a second heart attack in patients that have had a first heart attack. For patients that have never had a heart attack, they just have high cholesterol. Again, the benefit isn't quite as pronounced, and it's probably not quite as high as some people are led to believe. Um, Best thing to do, again, for almost any chronic condition, eat a very healthy diet and get an appropriate amount of physical activity. Um, Another number that they use, and you don't hear this a lot, is the number needed to treat, NNT. So in other words, how many patients are needed to treat with this intervention for one person to benefit? Okay, so in other words, if you're doing a surgery and putting stents in, let's say, uh, and you treat 10 people with this procedure, the inserting stents, how many people are actually going to benefit? How many cardiovascular events are going to be prevented, and how many people? And that's the number needed to treat. Hopefully 10 people are going to benefit. Um, I don't honestly know what the overall NNT is for stents. I would have to look that one up. But for statins, how many people do you need to treat? Again, this is people that have not had a first heart attack. For people that have not had a first heart attack and have high cholesterol, you need to treat somewhere between 60 and 100 people for one person to benefit, for one person to actually avoid a cardiovascular event. So, there are probably, I think the overall message here is that just taking a statin and not modifying your life, some of your life choices, probably isn't the best strategy for trying to prevent cardiovascular events. I think it's probably a combination of, a few different things, including exercise, of course. So let's talk about odds ratios briefly, also known as relative odds. So again, we're not going to have to do a calculation, but you're going to have to demonstrate that you know how to set this up for your create a study assignment, which is going to be submitted with the final exam. Okay, so again, this is our relative risk problem. We looked at this for our test for week, whatever it was, I think it was week 4. And again, pretty straightforward calculation. I think pretty much everybody got this one right. It's just for the calculate relative risk, you have the values for the incidence of the disease in the different groups. And for most cohort studies, relative risk is great. You can use this. There are some cohort studies where you can also use odds ratios. When you're looking at a case control study, though, you have to use odds ratios. You cannot use relative risk. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So again, when you're doing your create a study assignment, if you're just doing a straight up cohort study, you can get by using relative risk. If you wanted, you can also do odds ratios as well. But if you're doing a case control study, you have to use odds ratios. Okay, so you can read through this. This is a quote from the textbook, from the Gordis text. Just as the ratio of the incidence in the exposed to the incidence in the non-exposed can be used to measure an association of exposure and disease, we can also look at this from the ratio of the odds that the disease will develop in an exposed person compared to the odds that it will develop in a non-exposed person. Okay, and I have this word association in italics a few different times. So an association is what we're looking for. It's a measure of an association between an exposure and an outcome. And the strength of the higher the relative risk or the higher the odds ratios, the stronger that association is. So these are why some of these studies can be appropriate. It's not quite as strong as a placebo-controlled clinical trial, but they do offer some evidence they can offer evidence of an association between an exposure and an outcome. So that's why epidemiological studies, in some cases, and we'll talk about some of these are just a little bit more appropriate when you're looking at population studies. So in a cohort study, again, relative risk or odds ratios can be used. In a case control study, you can only use odds ratios. So let's take a look at this. And again, our 2x2 box, we can't get away from this thing, right? So the odds that an exposed person is going to the odds that an exposed person develops a disease is A divided by B. Okay, so that should make sense. A, people that were exposed and developed the disease, divided by people that were exposed and did not develop the disease. So if you remember in the relative risk, we used as the denominator the total number of people that were exposed. In this case, we're not using that total. It's just simply A divided by B. Okay, so for the odds that a person was not exposed would develop the disease is C divided by D. So people that were not exposed that developed the disease divided by people that were not exposed that did not develop the disease. Okay, and then for the total odds ratio, we take that first number and we divide it by the second number. Okay, and so it's the odds that an exposed person develops the disease divided by the odds that a non-exposed person develops the disease. That's the total odds ratio. And that's what our formula is going to look like. A divided by B in our numerator divided by C divided by D. Okay, and I forget what whatever the principle is under algebra about, when you have fractions within a fraction. I forget exactly what that rule is, but that final formula there, A times D divided by B times C. That's how you can. That's the final formula that you're going to use. And again, I forget whatever that principle is in algebra. That if you have a denominator in the numerator, then you can move it to the denominator. So I'm probably blowing everybody's mind with this, but hopefully you're all picking that up. Okay, but that's the basic formula: A times D divided by B times C. All right, so let's look at some problems. And then I'm sorry, there's another way to look at this. It depends how the information is given. Again, that last one was really for a straight cohort study, and then this would be a case control study. So it's just the information that they give you is a little bit different. In this case, you're looking at the odds that a person that has the disease was exposed to whatever that exposure of interest is, divided by the odds that a control was exposed. So again, think about the smoking and the lung cancer. So the odds that a person with lung cancer actually smoked divided by the odds that a person without lung cancer smoked. Okay, so that's kind of what, hopefully that'll help you kind of see this. So the formula there, A divided by C, divided by B divided by D, and again, you can use that kind of manipulation there, and that final formula, it comes out to be the same actually, A times D divided by B times C. So it doesn't matter which way you look at it, but that's the final formula that you want, A times D divided by B times C. So you should probably write that down and make sure that you understand how to manipulate that. So let's look at a problem here. We're going to calculate out both relative risk and odds ratio for this. Okay, so we have a total of 20,000 people. 10,000 were exposed. The other 10,000 were not exposed. Of the people that were exposed, 200 got the disease, and of the people that were not exposed, 100 got the disease. Okay, so straightforward relative risk problem. 200 divided by 10,000 divided by 100 divided by 10,000. And then when you calculate that all out, you come out to a relative risk of 2. So what that means is that obviously you have a much higher risk of disease if you're exposed, according to this cohort study. Now an odds ratio is a little bit different. A times D, so 200 times 9,900 divided by C times B, 100 times 9,800. And when you do that, you come up with an odds ratio of 2.02. Okay, so when a disease is infrequent, when you don't have a disease that's really rampant, that has a very high prevalence or incidence rate, you can use either odds ratio or relative risk in a cohort study. So if you're doing a cohort study on a relatively rare, I guess, disease, that would probably, tuberculosis would be a good example. Odds ratio is a good predictor. You can use the odds ratio for that to calculate that out. We're going to look at something where odds ratio is probably not ideal. And that's this problem here. So this is a problem very similar. 200 people total, 100 people were exposed, another 100 were not exposed. 50 people that were exposed got the disease versus 25 that were not exposed that got the disease. Okay, so again, relative risk, 50 divided by 100, divided by 25, divided by 100. We get a relative risk of 2. The odds ratio, though, comes out. I should have put that formula, A times D divided by C times B, sorry. And then we get an odds ratio of 3. So when the disease is frequent, when there's a disease, half the people that are exposed are going to get the disease. When the disease is very frequent, you should probably stick with relative risk. Okay, again, this is for a cohort study. For a case control study, you have to use odds ratios. Okay, so this is just practical application. This is a case control study of red meat and cancer risk. And if you choose to, I'm not going to read through all this. If you want to, you can pause this and just kind of read through this. But essentially, the more red meat that people eat, the higher the odds ratios of them getting cancer. So there's definitely a significant association here between red meat consumption and a variety of cancers. going from the larynx, the esophagus, the colon, the rectum, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, endometrial cancer, ovary cancer, fried meat, higher risk of cancer of the oral cavity and the esophagus. Risk of prostate cancer increase from meat cooked by roasting or grilling. So that's probably bad news for some people that, sorry, I know some of you mentioned that you like to barbecue. Sorry about that. So when you look at this, it's basically the more that you consume, that's when you see the association there, the odds ratios. Once a week is probably not a big deal, but it's probably more than none. But where they really see a high association is, 3, 4, 5 times a week. So I think that's when you definitely have to be careful. Okay. So attributable risk. We're not going to do a calculation for this. There's actually a pretty cool calculation if you just go to YouTube and just type in attributable risk calculation. Somebody posted something. It's probably another faculty member at another school, and they'll walk you through the attributable risk calculation. We're not going to have to do it, but I just wanted to talk about it briefly. So relative risk, obviously it's a measure of strength of association. Attributable risk considers how much of the disease that occurs can be attributed to a certain exposure. So in other words, how many of the lung cancer cases are attributable to smoking? What are some of the other risk factors for smoke or for lung cancer? Of all the colorectal cancers, how many of those colorectal cancers are attributable to red meat consumption versus other risk factors? Okay, so the amount or the proportion of the disease incidence that can be attributed to a specific exposure. Okay, so just a couple quotes there again from the Gordis text. All right. Really cool study, a prospective cohort study ongoing in Europe. It's called the InnerHeart study. And they're just collecting all kinds of data from Western Europe, different parts of Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Australia, the South and North America. And they're just looking at, attributable risks for a variety of conditions, smoking or risk factors, smoking, diabetes, abdominal obesity, and abnormal lipids. And you can still see that, abnormal lipids are still pretty, the most significant attributable risk for this is metabolic syndrome. So they love to, epidemiologists and biostat people love to gather all this data and just demonstrate, that there is certainly risks that, and these are of course modifiable risks. So just again, some more, again, I would highly recommend that you check out that study, InnerHeart study. It's a great cohort study to check out, similar to the Framingham study, but much bigger, much bigger. So this is another term that they use, disability adjusted life year. So it's basically, it's a measure that they use to kind of demonstrate attributable risk in different types of epidemiological studies. So this is from Australia. So disability adjusted life years. So it's basically, how many the likelihood essentially that you're going to have disability in your life. Your healthy life expectancy essentially is going to be decreased significantly by things like tobacco, physical inactivity, sedentary behavior. So it's not even really exercise. It's just sedentary behavior. That's the big problem. That's what we have to address. Exercise is a great form of physical activity, but it's just getting up and doing movement. So you're not sitting or standing or sitting or sleeping for 23 hours a day. Hypertension. It's interesting here. They have alcohol harm, but they also have alcohol benefit because it's been, again, if we look at the Harvard information, they mentioned that a glass or two of alcohol seems to benefit. And then, of course, some of the other risks that are up there. So insurance people love to look at this kind of stuff just to kind of evaluate, your overall risk. And they, calculate your insurance rates on this kind of stuff. Public health people, epidemiologists, biostat people, they will. I've seen studies where they actually will calculate out like the minutes of life lost for every like cigarette that you smoke and for every piece of red meat that you have. Some of these people are pretty intense. So you can find that information is certainly out there. And then this is kind of an interesting number that they use sometimes. It's called healthy life expectancy. So we all heard, you hear a lot about life expectancy, the total number of years that you're expected to live, but this is the total number of years that you can expect to live without disability, without significant disability. So good news in the United States in the past decade or so, we increased our overall life expectancy by about a year. The bad news is we decreased our healthy life expectancy by about a year. So we increased life expectancy by relying on more intense medical interventions, essentially. And we actually decreased our overall healthy life expectancy. And again, it's primarily chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, things like that. Part of it is also because you're living longer, you're just going to have, you're more likely to get cancer, things like that, or cardiovascular disease. So there's a number of different reasons why that can affect healthy life expectancy. Okay, so that's all I had. I hope this was helpful.